The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched my clothes?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, she came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother, those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. Jesus strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Grace and peace to you from God, our Creator, Jesus, our Redeemer, and the Holy Spirit who sustains us. Amen. So today's gospel lesson is classic Mark. It's a sandwich. So I don't know if you noticed, but we started with Jairus and his daughter, and Jairus begging Jesus for help, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes this hemorrhaging woman who touches Jesus, and then as soon as Jesus is still talking to her, somebody comes in and tells Jairus that his daughter has died, and Jesus goes and heals her too, right? So it's a sandwich. Two stories. The story of Jairus' daughter is kind of like the bread, and the story of the hemorrhaging woman is like the meat and cheese, right in the middle. And Mark does this. It's a literary device that he uses a lot. He uses this because one story helps us to interpret the other. They help us to read each other. It's almost like you're reading the story of Jairus' daughter with a magnifying glass of the hemorrhaging woman and vice versa. It's like a lens to read the other story. And these two stories, they have a lot in common, and then they have some differences too. They both are stories of death to life. The 12-year-old girl was dead. The hemorrhaging woman, she might as well have been dead. She'd been suffering for 12 years. She'd lost all her money. She'd lost her standing in society. She was considered unclean. And Jesus brings life. He brings healing, not just healing, but holistic healing to both of these women in this story. And then also, they're both, the number 12 is in both of these stories. One of them suffering for 12 years, the other only 12 years old. One of them at the end of their fertility window, the other at the beginning. And then we have a named, powerful man, Jairus, a religious leader with a name in the story, and a woman who has lost all her power because of her ailment, and she is unnamed. We know her only as the hemorrhaging woman. Unnamed. Yet she is the exemplar of faith in the story, not the religious leader. She is the one. She is the exemplar of faith. These two stories, side by side, help us to interpret one another. And I love the story of the hemorrhaging woman and what Jesus says to her after she is healed. He says to her, "Your faith has made you well." Your faith has made you well. She persists, this woman. She persists. She has gone through so much. 12 years. I don't know if you've navigated our healthcare system for 1 month, but navigating it for 12 years is a nightmare. Spending all of your money, reaching out constantly in good faith, trying to do what the next best thing, it's exhausting, it's demoralizing, and nevertheless, she persists. She persists. And she hears about this Jesus guy, and she shows up, and she reaches out. Her hand, with hope and faith, she reaches out. And she touches the hem of Jesus' robe, and she is healed. She crosses all boundaries. She touches a man without his consent. She is an unclean woman touching someone else. She crosses all the boundaries. She does all the wrong things according to societal norms. And that's why she trembles at Jesus' feet when he said, "Who touched me?" But Jesus isn't angry with her. Instead, he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Your faith has made you well. Your risk was worth it all. And I love, something stood out to me in the story this week that hasn't stood out to me before that I love, and it says, she knew in her body that she was healed. She knew in her body. That detail had never stood out to me before in this story. But she knew in her body that she had been healed. And Jesus knew in his body that power had gone out from him. And he's looking around. Who could have done this? And his disciples kind of make fun of him, like, really? You think you're going to figure it out in this large crowd? They both knew in their bodies that something special had happened. That something had occurred in that moment. They both knew it in their bodies. And I love this because too often, I don't know about you, but I get so caught up in my head that I neglect my body. I get so caught up in doing the next thing that I forget what's going on with my body. Have I eaten? Have I drank enough water today? I don't know. Probably not. But she knew in her body that she had been healed. She was paying attention. Well, because for 12 years, she had to pay very close attention to her body, of course. What's it like to know in our body healing or even brokenness? To know in our body disconnection? You know that feeling when you say something you didn't mean to say and you get that pit in your stomach? Oh, why did I do that? You know in your body. Paying attention to that knowing is something that I want to lean into. And Dr. Becky Kennedy talks about knowing in our body when we've made a mistake because she talks about something called repair. And I've been thinking about this TED Talk that I watched from her on repair this week as I prepared for this sermon. I would encourage you to go back and watch it. It's if you search Dr. Becky Kennedy Repair TED Talk, it'll come up. And she writes this book called Good Inside. It's a book about parenting. And it's a book about how all children are good inside, and what if we parented them as if they were good inside and started from that place? That shouldn't be too hard for us to do as Christians. We believe that everyone is created in the image of God after all, that we are all loved by God. So this starting place kind of makes sense for us. But she talks about something called repair. And repair is when there's a moment of disconnection, going back to that moment and talking about what was going on and taking accountability for your actions and then talking about and taking accountability for what you will do differently the next time. She gives the example of yelling at her son in the kitchen when he complains about what's for dinner and going back to that moment and repairing as a parent. But repair can be for all of us in our relationships, all of our relationships, not just for parents. She says this is the single most important piece of advice that she would give is to repair. Go back to those moments of disconnection, take accountability, And then name what you will do differently the next time and do it differently the next time. That's repair. And she says in order to do this, we have to first repair with ourselves, because often what keeps us from doing this is the shame around what we did, and we don't believe we're good inside because of the mistake that we made. But the mistake doesn't define us, and we are good inside, and it is something that we did, but it's not us. So we can take accountability for that and do something different the next time, because again, it's not us. So first we have to repair with ourselves, and then we repair with the one that we've hurt. Our child, our spouse, our neighbor, whoever it may be. And I love this twofold model of repair because it reminds me a lot of how we begin our worship services. We begin with a time of confession and forgiveness, where we're repairing with ourselves and with God. Not coming with shame, but coming knowing that God forgives us and loves us as God's beloved children. And then the very next thing that we do in worship is we share the peace. An opportunity to repair with one another. We can seek out if there's someone who we need to repair with and who we're disconnected from, and we can share peace. This actually, the whole idea of sharing the peace in worship, it comes before communion in our liturgy because we need to reconcile before we come to the table. That's the idea of it. So we repair with ourselves in the confession and forgiveness, and we repair with God, and then we repair with our neighbor in the sharing of the peace. It's built into our liturgy, this model of repair. Dr. Kennedy also talks about repair is not just an apology. She says we've gotten a practice of apology as shutting down connection and shutting down conversation, because oftentimes when we apologize, we expect the other person to just forgive us right off the bat. I'm sorry I did that, and we expect them to say, okay, and move on. But too often our apologies sound a little something like this: I'm sorry I did that, but you did this thing, or there's an excuse there. And the accountability piece and the doing better next time isn't always there in our apologies. So instead, repair opens up a conversation for getting to the root of why we did the thing we did and how we're going to do something different next time. It opens up, repair does. It doesn't shut down. Well, we've been talking about repair all week at VBS, where the theme was Operation Restoration, Mending God's World. I loved this curriculum for VBS. I loved this theme, and Haley and the VBS team did a great job putting on VBS. We had dinner every night, and then after dinner there were skits and a song, and the skits were all about repair around a lemonade stand, all about stories of Jesus and the ways that he mended God's world and the ways that we can continue to do that in our world. 3 of the stations that I ran this week one was around bird seed, and we told the story of God giving the Israelite people manna in the wilderness, and we talked about how feeding is important, and we are to feed the people in the world. They made bread starters at another station to make bread, but we talked about how we're not just to feed people, but we're to feed all of God's creation, so that's why we did the bird seed. We can feed the birds too. And then the next day, we talked about forgiveness. The next day, we talked about healing. We talked about Jesus healing the woman who was bent over, but very relevant to our gospel lesson today, too, of Jesus healing the hemorrhaging woman and the girl who died, bringing her back to life. Again, we talked about how we can be agents of healing in the world. We talked about healing the earth and helping to reverse the impact of climate change. And we talked about compost. And we have a compost here at church, so we went and we checked out the compost. And I brought some of my worms from my compost at home, and each child got to make a jar of compost, and they got to take some pet worms home to help break that stuff down. And how we can help to heal the earth through things like compost. And then the last day was about forgiveness. The last day that I was at was about forgiveness. And I loved this image. It's kind of like a volcano. We did the vinegar and baking soda thing, right? And we talked about how if we aren't able to forgive, our anger builds inside of us and it turns into resentment, and then we explode because we have so much of that anger within us. So we had a Ziploc baggie and put baking soda and vinegar, and if you sealed it just right and shook it up, it would bust to represent that resentment and that anger bursting out of us. And so we talked about coping mechanisms. We talked about strategies for dealing with our anger and our frustration and getting to a place of repair and a place of forgiveness. And our young people, they have great coping skills and great strategies. They talked about their school counselors. They talked about box breathing. They talked about exercise. They talked about talking it out. They talked about locking yourself in your room and taking some space that you need for yourself. And we practiced meditating. And in the meditation, we had to practice forgiving ourselves and forgiving our neighbor. And then we had to think about a time where we had harmed someone as well. Maybe go back to that point of repair. This VBS curriculum was so beautiful and so relevant for all of us. The motto of the week was, I'll do the hand motions for you, Menders, Menders, 1, 2, 3, Menders, Menders, God and me. That was the motto that the students did every night before they went to their stations. And I love this because it holds that tension of our faith. That tension of God acting on our behalf, but also us being compelled to act on behalf of our neighbor. It's a both and. Both God is doing the healing in our world. But yes, the moral arc bends towards justice. Yes, God is active. And also we have a part to play. Menders, menders, God and me. We can be menders and healers too. And we're actually called to do just that. We are called to help to bring about that holistic healing. And of course, this healing, it always happens in relationship. Because if we don't care about something, we're not going to mend it. We're not going to repair it. Think about the car that is only worth what's the junk parts, and the repair would cost more than the junk parts, right? You just send that car to the dump. But that's not what our relationships are like. It's so much more meaningful than that. We care deeply about one another, and we want to make those repairs. We want to make those mends. And Jesus cares so deeply in this story. He cares so deeply about Jairus' daughter that even though he got caught up in the moment and caught up in the hemorrhaging woman in the crowd, he goes back to repair. He goes back to heal. He cares so deeply about the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years that he heals her. He repairs. He brings holistic healing and restoration. And this healing is holistic. That woman goes from an unnamed woman to being called daughter, to being called child of God, to being connected to her neighbor and to Jesus. It's holistic. And the girl who was brought back to life, Jesus doesn't just bring her back and leave. He says, give this girl something to eat. She needs to eat. It's holistic. She needs community. She needs to sit around a table with family and friends and share in a meal. She needs the sustenance to keep on living. This healing is relational and it's holistic. And it shows a deep, deep care for the earth, a deep, deep care for one another. Whenever I read this gospel lesson, I always come back to this place right here. This is a church in Magdala, Israel, where the mural behind the altar is a zoomed-in version of this story. You see the feet of the crowd, the feet of Jesus, and you see the woman touching the hem of Jesus' robe. It's a beautiful mural. It's called Encounter. And it depicts so perfectly the power of a small moment of encounter, the power of a small moment of repair, the power of a small moment of mending. The mystery, we don't know how that moment happened, how that healing took place. And the beauty of something small making something huge happen in that woman's life, in that child of God's life, in that daughter's life. So my invitation for you this week is to reach out in faith. Reach out in faith and in hope, knowing that God is a mending God. God is a God of repair. God is a God of healing. And to also reach out in faith and hope and be an agent of repair and mending and healing in your world wherever you can. Amen.